I'm 34 years old, my name is Colleen, and on my wedding day the first 2 seats in the front row stayed empty from the first note of the music to the last. That morning I called my mother from the little upstairs room where I was getting dressed, absolutely certain there had been a wreck on the interstate. She laughed. She said, "Oh, was that today?" Behind her I could hear my sister laughing too, and glasses touching, and a string quartet warming up. I said, "Okay, Mom," nothing else. Then I posted one photograph. 6 hours later my parents were standing at the bottom of the barn drive with their headlights still on, gray as ash, and what my mother asked me to do next is the whole reason I'm telling you this. If you've ever loved somebody who lived for what the neighbors thought, stay with me. I promise you this story ends somewhere good. To explain those 2 empty seats, I have to take you back to the fall of 1998. I was 8 years old. My father, Ray Bauer, had run a hardware store on 7th Street in Rockford, Illinois for 11 years, the kind of place where men came in for one wing nut and stayed 40 minutes. That October the big box store opened out by the highway with a parking lot the size of a runway, and by Thanksgiving my dad was carrying the last of his inventory out to a rented truck in the dark so nobody would watch him do it. We lost the store. We nearly lost the house. And I want to be fair to my mother here, because fair matters more than anger in a story like this. Marlene Bauer did not become who she became out of vanity. She became it out of pure animal fear. I remember the exact night it turned. There was a church potluck the week after the store closed, and my mother almost didn't go, and then she put on lipstick at the hall mirror with her hands shaking and made us all get in the car. And I watched her walk into that fellowship hall and become somebody. She organized the serving line. She found a folding table nobody else had thought of. She laughed at the right time in every single conversation. And by the time we drove home, 2 different women had offered my father work, one at a lumberyard, one hanging drywall, because they liked her. That was the lesson, and our whole family learned it in one evening. The town saved us, therefore the town must never, ever be given a reason to look away. My mother joined everything after that. The hospital auxiliary, the garden club, the altar guild, the 4th of July committee. She ran the pancake breakfast for 19 years. She was the woman who showed up at your door with a hot dish the same day your mother died, and I mean that as a genuine compliment because she was good at it and people needed her. But somewhere in there the hot dish stopped being about your mother, and I was 8, watching fear put on lipstick and call it self-service. It took me 26 more years to understand what that rescue actually cost. It cost us the kitchen table, the place where a family sits down with nobody watching and nothing to prove. Once that was gone, the rest went quietly, one small absence at a time. By the time I was 12, our house ran like a staging area. There was a laminated calendar on the refrigerator with everybody's obligations color-coded. There was a closet by the back door with a shelf of what my mother called ready gifts. Candles, hand towels, jars of jam, in case somebody had a baby or a funeral, and we needed to arrive with something in our hands within the hour. Appearances were not a hobby in our house. They were the flood insurance. My sister Devon came along when I was 6, and Devon was born knowing how to be looked at. Blonde, dimpled, easy. At 4 she'd sing at the Christmas program with her hands folded like a little angel. At 9 she was in the Rockford paper twice in 1 year. People would stop my mother in the grocery store just to say something about Devon, and I would watch my mother's whole face turn on like a porch light. Me, I was the other one. Tall too early, quiet, glasses, the kind of kid who reads the encyclopedia entry about frostbite for fun. Nobody sat me down and told me I wasn't the one being shown. It was gentler than that, which honestly made it worse. I got assigned what my mother called the important part. Colleen, run the coat check. Colleen, count the ticket money. Colleen, keep an eye on your sister's hem. Colleen, step back a little, honey, you're blocking the light. Little by little, I moved out of the family portrait the way a name fades off a mailbox. No announcement. No decision anybody ever had to defend out loud. And here's the part it took me 2 decades to say to another human being. I didn't fight it. I organized it. I made the lists. I carried the folding chairs. If I couldn't be the one people looked at, I would be the reason there was anything to look at. And I told myself that was the same as being loved. It is not the same. But you don't learn that at 12. You learn it at 34 in a wedding dress, listening to a string quartet on the other end of a phone call. When I was 17, I won a state award for a project I'd worked on for 5 months, a study I did on medication mix-ups among elderly patients living alone, because even then that was the kind of kid I was. There was a ceremony in a hotel ballroom in Springfield with bad carpet and a podium. I saved 2 seats with my winter coat. Both stayed empty the entire afternoon. My mother had promised, but the auxiliaries' fall bazaar had a table shortage, and Davin had a dance recital that got moved, and I'm quoting her exactly here, "Somebody has to be the face of this family, Colleen." I drove home 3 hours with a plaque riding on the passenger seat like a hitchhiker I'd picked up out of pity. When I walked in the door, the kitchen was full of women wrapping raffle baskets, and my mother waved at me without turning around. Later that night, I found her alone at the sink, and I asked her quietly why she hadn't told anyone. Not one person at that bazaar knew her daughter had won a state award that day, and my mother looked at me with real, honest kindness, the way you'd look at a child who hasn't figured out how the world works yet, and gave me the sentence that ran our entire family like a constitution. "If nobody sees it, honey, it may as well not have happened, and nobody claps for the girl holding the ladder." Then she patted my cheek with a wet hand and went back to the dishes. I stood there holding a prize for a project about things that get overlooked, and I remember thinking, with the flat calm I would later get paid to have in emergencies, that she wasn't being cruel, she was being accurate. In her world, I had genuinely not happened. It would take me 17 more years to find out whether that world had a door. Every operation needs somebody who actually runs it, and for 20 years, that was me. Off the record, unpaid, essential. When my grandmother broke her hip, the winter I was 19, I was the one who slept in the vinyl recliner beside her bed for 11 nights, because a hospital room is not a place anybody gets credit for. My mother came Sunday afternoons with flowers and stayed 40 minutes and posted a photo of the flowers. When my father's second job fell apart and their taxes turned into a shoebox of receipts and a letter from the state, I was the one at that kitchen table at midnight with a calculator, 20 years old, teaching myself what a payment plan was. And when Devin was 19 and got picked up on a Dewey 3 blocks from the church, I was the one who drove down from Madison at 2 in the morning, and I was the one who wrote the letter she read to the deacons, and I was the one who called 11 people so my mother could say the words, "were," just so grateful for our community without her voice breaking. People called it grace. It was me, holding a script. I kept their real life running so their nice one could shine, and I called that love. Understand, I wasn't a hostage, I was a volunteer, and that's much harder to admit. Being needed was the one seat nobody could move me out of. My mother would squeeze my shoulder after I fixed something and say, "You're the backbone of this family, Colleen." And I would run on that one sentence for a solid month, like a phone at 2% finding a charger. A backbone, if you think about it, is the part of you that never shows up in a picture. It holds the whole person up. And the only time anybody mentions it is when it breaks. Mine didn't break for 20 years. It just quietly stopped believing. Nursing was my way out, and I went through that door the expensive way, loans in my own name, a Buick with a heater that only worked on high, nursing school at Madison, then a med-surg floor, and then, at 29, hospice. I know, people hear hospice and they get quiet, but I'll tell you the truth, it's the only place I've ever worked where nobody's pretending. When a man has 9 days left, there is not one single ounce of performance left in the house. You walk in and everything is simply, finally real. After a childhood like mine, that felt like walking out of a costume shop into fresh air. My family attended none of it, not the pinning ceremony, not the graduation. Per the Constitution, those things did not happen. But here's what did happen. My second year in hospice, I got a case out in Belvidere. Eleanor Kozlowski, 79, ovarian cancer, and her husband Walter, who had been married to her for 56 years, and who had not, as far as I could tell, ever once made himself a meal. I was in that house 4 days a week for 2 months. I taught an 81-year-old man how to run a washing machine. I sat on the edge of Eleanor's bed at 4 in the morning, while she told me about the summer they met at a roller rink in Beloit and how he'd worn a shirt he'd clearly borrowed. Eleanor died on a Tuesday in February with her hand in mine and her husband's hand on her hair. Nobody took a picture. It remains one of the most important things I've ever been part of. Remember Walter. He matters later more than anybody. Somewhere in those years I met Owen Lindgren. Owen restores old barns, takes down 100-year-old timber frames, numbers every beam, and puts them back up somewhere else. I met him because he was working on a barn behind a farmhouse where one of my patients was dying, and he turned his saws off every day for 6 weeks whenever my car was in the driveway. Didn't tell me. I found out from the patient's daughter after the funeral. On our third date, he pulled out an old film camera, the kind you wind with your thumb, and took exactly one picture of me laughing at something across the table. I asked why only one. He said, "Because you look down when you laugh, not at the lens. One's plenty." I eventually married that sentence. But first I had to understand what he'd seen in that one frame, that I'd spent my whole life around people taking pictures, and not one of those cameras had ever been pointed at me out of love. The first time Owen took me to his parents' place for supper, I sat in the driveway for a full minute out of pure habit, rehearsing. Then I walked into a kitchen where nobody rearranged the food. Nobody moved the casserole toward the window. His mother, Ruth, a retired school nurse, 68 years old, hands like a woman who has cleaned up after 4 decades of other people's children, handed me a peeler and said, "Potatoes don't wait." We ate at a table with 4 different chairs. Owen's father knocked over the salt and everybody just kept going. And after supper, Ruth washed and I dried, and she asked me about my week, and then she did something I had absolutely no training for. She listened to the whole answer, every sentence, and then she asked a follow-up question about something I'd said at the very beginning, which meant she'd been listening at the beginning. I got in my car afterward, made it about 2 blocks, and had to pull over on a dark county road because I was crying and could not have told you why. I'm a nurse. I know what that was. That was a starving person's body reacting to an ordinary meal, not a feast. Just a normal, human-sized portion of being seen, served without an audience, and my whole system had no idea what to do with it. Ruth Lindgren never once tried to be my mother. Remember that, too. She just stood, quietly, in the exact place where a mother is supposed to stand. Owen asked me to marry him on a September evening at a place called Kestrel Hill, outside Mineral Point, Wisconsin, a 110-year-old dairy barn he'd spent 2 summers helping bring back, sitting on a ridge over a meadow with the sun going down behind it. He asked with his hands shaking so badly he dropped the ring in the grass, and we had to look for it with a flashlight for 11 minutes, which I'm glad about because it's the funniest thing that has ever happened to me. For about a day and a half, it was ours. I remember writing careful little messages to my aunt, to my college roommate, to the 2 nurses I worked nights with, because I wanted to tell people in the right order. The human order. I never got to send them. I found out my engagement had been announced when a patient's daughter congratulated me in a farmhouse hallway in Stoughton, holding out her phone. My mother had posted it, not just posted it, she had gotten ahead of it, a photograph of my ring that I had sent her privately, cropped, with a long paragraph underneath about raising strong daughters, and a line thanking by name the jeweler in Rockford where my mother thinks Owen should have bought it, 240 comments. And at church that Sunday, before I had told one single friend, 40-some people already knew, because my mother had stood up during announcements and shared the news with the whole congregation. I called her from the parking lot. She was thrilled I'd seen it. She wanted to tell me how many people had reached out. That night, Owen held my hand across his kitchen table and asked me one question that redrew the entire map of my life. He said, "Forget who's watching. What do you actually want to remember?" And out of my mouth came a wedding. I had never once let myself say out loud, small, 70 people, September at Kestrel Hill in the meadow under the barn, my friend Marcus and his bluegrass band, Ruth Stahalias, and no phones, no pictures on the internet, no cameras at all, except one kind. And I'll get to that because an $11 piece of plastic ends up carrying this entire story. My mother heard the word 70 people and reacted the way you'd react to a diagnosis. 6 months later, that one small rule would be the reason her whole world came down, and she was the one who built it. Let me ask you something, and I do want to know, have you ever found out news about your own life from somebody else's mouth? Somebody who beat you to it on purpose? Hang on to that feeling? Because when you hear what my mother chose over my wedding, I want you to remember this engagement announcement. It was never about a ring. We planned that wedding the way you'd plan a field hospital. By hand, cheap, with people we trusted. 70 chairs borrowed from 3 different churches. Ruth's dahlias and coffee cans. Owen sanded the reception floor in that barn over 4 weekends with a rented machine and came home each Sunday covered in 100 years of dust. My mother treated every single detail as an opening offer. She called it helping. Colleen, the club can do 300. Don't say no yet. Colleen, at least let Ginny do the flowers, she'll be so hurt. Colleen, the Gazette still runs wedding photos and I've already spoken to them. Colleen, 70 people and no photographs? Sweetheart, that isn't a wedding, that's a rumor. And every time I said no, her face did the same thing, and I want to describe it carefully because it's the key to everything that came after. She did not look hurt, she looked bewildered, and then, underneath the bewilderment, she looked frightened, the way somebody looks when you suggest unplugging a machine they are personally attached to. Near the end of one long phone call, her voice dropped out of its bright register and she said, "If nobody sees it, then it's like it," and she caught herself and stopped. But we both heard the rest of it. We've been living inside that sentence since 1998. I hung up and stood in my kitchen and understood, clinically, what I had become to her. I had stopped being the backbone. A backbone is useful. I had turned into something far more dangerous to a family like mine, an event with nothing in it for the audience. And in that economy, you don't attend those. You schedule over them. Which, on the third Saturday of September, is exactly what they did. There's one more piece you need, or the rest won't make sense. My mother was losing her grip, and only 4 people on earth knew it. She was 61. The auxiliary had passed her over for president 2 years running in favor of a woman 15 years younger with a marketing degree. The garden club had folded, the Gazette had gone to twice a week and dropped half the community page. My father, at 64, had a bad shoulder and a part-time job at a farm supply. The women who used to call her every morning had grandchildren in Arizona now. My mother had built her entire self out of being needed by a town, and the town had quietly gotten smaller around her. Devin told me this back when Devin still told me things, that Mom had started staying up late, going through old photo albums, calling people who didn't call back. And then in June the letter came. The Rock River Foundation was holding its Centennial Founders Ball in September, and my mother had been selected as one of 3 honorees for Lifetime Community Service. Head table, a plaque. 240 people at the Rock River Club, the same club that had a waiting list she'd been on since 2004, a photographer, a program with her picture in it. Saturday, September 21st. She did not read that letter the way you or I would read it. She read it the way a drowning woman reads the word rope. Now here's the part that still hurts in cold weather. I asked Devin to be my maid of honor. Understand what I was really asking. My sister and I had never once had anything that was just ours. Not one memory that hadn't been arranged by somebody else first. She was 28, working at a title company, still living 12 minutes from our parents, still getting called every Saturday morning with a list. I asked her over pancakes at a diner on East State Street, just us. And for about 2 seconds I watched something come awake in her face. She said, "Me? Really?" And her voice was 9 years old. She said she'd start looking at dresses. She said the word sisters, like she was trying it on. Then the Founders Ball landed on the calendar. And I know now from my father that Devin actually pushed back for a full day, which in our family was a revolution. Then the machine did what the machine does. The word family got used as a verb. My mother cried, which in our house was never sadness, it was strategy. And on the Thursday night before my wedding, my phone lit up with a message from my only sister that I can still recite word for word. It's one afternoon, Colleen. Yours is small, anyway. I read it maybe 30 times. And underneath the hurt, the nurse in me flagged something else, something quieter. There was no exclamation point. Devin put exclamation points on grocery lists. Devin put exclamation points on condolences. What I heard in that flat little sentence was not cruelty. It was exhaustion, the bone-deep kind. A woman reading a line she didn't believe anymore. Hold on to that. Her story isn't over. 2 weekends before the wedding, I made one last trip down to Rockford, sat at that kitchen table under the laminated calendar and asked my mother plainly to choose. I said, "It's my wedding, Mom." I didn't raise my voice. In my line of work, the more serious it gets, the quieter I get, and I have never in my life been quieter. She reached across the table and took my hand, warm as anything, and said, "And this is the only recognition I have ever gotten in my life, sweetheart. It can't be moved. We'll do you properly afterward. October, when the leaves are good. Real photographs. You'll thank me." There it was. My wedding demoted to a rough draft. I looked at my father. Ray Bauer was standing at the counter with a screwdriver, taking apart a toaster that worked fine, and he did not look up. He never does. That man has avoided eye contact since the first Bush administration. Here's the confession that matters, though. When I got home, Owen asked how it went, and I said they might be running late. There's a thing. Might be running late. 20 years of training does not evaporate because you're angry. I was still the family editor, still cutting their worst takes before anybody could see them, still protecting the one man who loved me from the truth about the people who made me. Remember that lie. I had to unlearn it in front of 70 people. And one more detail, because it becomes important, they never declined. The reply card came back marked yes. All 3 names, my mother's handwriting. Because in her world, you never put a cancellation in writing. Canceling looks bad. Simply not arriving apparently does not. The rehearsal dinner was Friday night at a supper club in Mineral Point. 22 of us at one long table, fried chicken, and an old-fashioned bar in a fish tank by the door. 3 chairs at the end sat empty. According to the group message, the Bowers were on the road. Traffic's awful, which would have been more convincing if my mother hadn't posted a photograph that afternoon of her dress bag hanging on a closet door in Rockford. I watched Owen's college roommate glance at those chairs, then at me, then develop a sudden deep interest in the breadbasket. That specific kindness, people pretending not to notice your wound, is its own kind of pain. I had my hand on my water glass, and I had the speech loaded, the smoothing over speech. My folks have just got so much on their plate, and Ruth Lindgren stood up at the far end of that table. She didn't say one word about traffic. She picked up her plate, her silverware, and her glass, walked the entire length of the table, and sat down in the empty chair beside me like her name had been on it the whole time. She smelled like rosemary and hand lotion. She put her hand over mine for a second, the way nurses do, a touch with a purpose and a dose. And she leaned in and said, "Just for me, I'm not here to be seen, honey. I'm here to see you." Then she asked somebody to pass the coleslaw and started telling a story about Owen at 9 years old in a go-kart, and the whole table laughed, and dinner just went on around the hole in it. I got through the toasts, I smiled on cue, but somewhere under my ribs, a belief I'd carried my entire life, the one that said you have to earn your seat at every table, quietly laid down and stopped breathing. It would be all the way dead by Saturday night. Now I have to show you the basket, because everything that happens later happens because of it. It's a Lindgren family tradition, 3 generations old. At their weddings, there's a wicker basket on a table at the door, and next to it a crate of disposable cameras, the plastic kind you wind with your thumb, 27 pictures, no screen. The rule is written on a card in Ruth's handwriting. Phones sleep in the basket, cameras go with you. Take whatever you love. We'll find out later what was real. No checking, no deleting, no taking it again because somebody blinked. 27 frames of faith per person. Ruth told me her mother started it in the 1960s for the opposite problem, farmers who wouldn't get in a picture at all, and the tradition just kept working while the sickness reversed itself. The night before the wedding, Owen put one of those cameras in my hand. It weighs nothing. It costs about $11. I turned it over and shook it, and it made this small dry rattle, film against plastic. I want you to remember that sound. It's the smallest sound in this story, and the most important one. No storage, no audience, no numbers, just a roll of film that would come back from the lab as whatever the day actually was. Blurry, crooked, true. I stood in that kitchen, holding $11 worth of honesty, and I thought about the photographer my mother had wanted, and I laughed out loud, alone. I did not know yet that a plastic camera was the hinge my whole life would turn on. Saturday came up the way Wisconsin does it in September to show off. Cold gold light. Mist in the low part of the meadow until 9. The maples on the ridge just starting to turn. In the front row, 2 chairs had cream ribbon on the backs and a small card in my own handwriting. It said family. They were due at 9 for coffee and hair and all the small backstage rituals a mother is supposed to hover through. At 9:40, the gravel lot was filling with fans and cousins, and their car wasn't in it. At 10:30, my calls went to voicemail, and I stood at that upstairs window doing the arithmetic I do professionally. Rockford is 2.5 hours out. If they left right now, they'd still make the ceremony. And underneath the arithmetic, the older, dumber program's still running. They're just late. They're always late. Breathe. At 11:15, my mother finally picked up. I can give you that call almost exactly, because some audio your brain files under permanent. I said, Mom, thank God, are you all right? Where are you? And there was a pause with a smile in it. And then my mother's voice, bright and unhurried and genuinely amused. Oh, was that today, honey? The ball's been on the calendar since June. Behind her, I heard glasses touching. I heard a quartet tuning, and I heard my sister laugh, the good laugh, the one she's had since she was 9. They weren't lost. They weren't hurt. They were 140 miles away, at a luncheon, getting ready to be photographed. I looked at myself in the mirror, a hospice nurse in a white dress, and the strangest thing happened, which was nothing. No scream came up. A kind of flat calm came down over me like a drape over a surgical field. I said, okay, Mom, nothing else. And I meant it. Then I hung up, set the phone face down, and sat very still, because I had about 11 minutes to decide who I was going to be. Let me tell you how long 11 minutes is. It's about the length of a full code, long enough for an entire team to fight for a life, long enough to call it. Somewhere around minute 9, I stopped working on the patient, not my family, the story about my family, the one where they come through at the end, the one I had been keeping alive single-handed since I was 8 years old. I let the flat line be a flat line, and the mercy of it was what was still standing when the noise stopped. Outside my window were 70 people who had taken time off and driven 4 hours and traded shifts to sit and borrow chairs for me. And the small triage voice I trust with actual lives said, the problem is not that nobody loves you, the problem is 2 empty seats in the front row, and seats can be filled. There was a knock. Ruth came in, took one look at my face, and did not ask what happened, which is how I knew she already knew. She didn't hug me. She didn't hand me a tissue. She didn't say one word about my mother. She stood there in her good blue dress, a woman with 40 years of other people's worst days in her hands, and she said, those seats don't have to stay empty if you'll allow it. I said, allow what? And Ruth Lindgren smiled with about half her mouth, pulled a folded piece of notebook paper out of her purse, and asked me a question that made no sense at 11:26 in the morning, and made perfect sense by 2 o'clock. She said, honey, how many of your families live within an hour of this hill? We started 20 minutes late, and we never printed a program, so nobody ever knew. I won't pretend I floated down that aisle. Walking toward the man you love, past the seats your own parents decided to skip, is a very specific kind of split screen, and I lived both halves of it at once. But my old charge nurse, Dorothy, who once talked me through my first patient death in a stairwell at 3 in the morning, met me at the top of the aisle and offered her arm and said, I've seen you walk into worse rooms than this. The meadow did what a meadow does in September. The wind came up the ridge and moved through the grass in long, slow waves, and once, in the middle of the vows, a red-tailed hawk went over, and everybody looked up at the same time and then laughed at themselves, and not one glowing rectangle in the air. Not one. 70 faces, unobstructed, all of them pointed at me. I have never seen anything like it in my life, and I almost lost my composure at how naked it felt. Owen is not a man who makes speeches. He shook through most of his vows, and then he landed the one line he'd clearly been carrying around for months. He said, you've spent your whole life standing just outside the picture. I intend to spend mine looking right at you. I made a sound that was not dignified, and when we turned around to face everybody as married people, I finally let myself look, really look, at the front row, at who was sitting in my family's chairs. Because the minute I nodded, Ruth had walked out to the parking lot with her phone and worked down a list she'd apparently been keeping for 2 years without telling me, every family who had ever gripped her hand at the grocery store or found her at church and said some version of, if that girl ever needs anything at all, you call us. It turns out that when you spend your career sitting with people on the worst nights of their lives, a net quietly knits itself underneath you. Ruth just went out and shook it. In the first seat, on the aisle, in a gray suit that had last been worn to his wife's funeral, sat Walter Kozlowski, 83 years old now, hair combed with water, holding a card he'd written himself. Next to him, Denise, whose husband Tom I'd cared for the spring before, with her 2 grown sons, behind them the Ferrises, and beside Walter, in a dress with a stiff bow, a 9-year-old named Nora, whose grandmother Josie died in my arms in a farmhouse outside Verona, and who had asked me at that time, very seriously, whether nurses were allowed to be sad. 11 people, on about 90 minutes' notice, some of them driving an hour and a half in clothes they'd had to iron in a hurry. When the officiant introduced us as husband and wife, Walter Kozlowski, 83 years old, with a bad hip, was the first one on his feet, and the whole meadow followed him up. I stood in that noise and understood something with total clarity. My mother had measured this day, decided there was no audience worth showing up for, and been wrong about the count. The audience of my life had just RSVP'd to a different address, and I hadn't posted a thing yet. Before we get to the headlights, do me a favor. If somebody ever filled an empty chair for you, a neighbor, a nurse, a friend who just showed up when nobody made them, tell me about them. Say their name. Because the second half of this is about what happens when the people who should have been in those chairs find out who was. After the ceremony, we did pictures out along the fence line, where the afternoon light had gone the color of cider. Ruth's niece shot the whole thing on film and posed absolutely nobody. She just followed us around while my dress picked up a green hem of Wisconsin grass, and Nora taught me a clapping game with too many steps, and Walter told Owen the roller rink story about the borrowed shirt. At some point I walked back to the table by the barn door alone and stood over that wicker basket with 70 phones asleep in it. Here is exactly what I did and exactly what I did not do, because the difference is the whole story. I took my phone out for the first time since that morning. I opened it to one photograph the film photographer had taken on my phone at my own request. 1. Me in the grass-stained dress, Walter on my arm, laughing with his head back, Denise and her boys, Nora with her hand in mine, Ruth's hand on my shoulder like a rank insignia. I posted it to my little Facebook page. Nurses and cousins and college roommates. No location, no tags, no mention of anybody who wasn't in that frame. Just one line I'd apparently been writing since I was 17 years old with a plaque on the passenger seat. The front row was full. Then I pressed post, watched the bar go across, and dropped my phone back into that basket like a stone into a well. 2 minutes, start to finish, and I did not look at it again for the rest of the night. That's not me bragging, that's the entire point. For the first time in my life, I had put something true out into the world and felt absolutely no need to stand there and watch it perform. Meanwhile, 140 miles south, the fuse was already lit, and I hadn't lit it. She had. While I was getting married, the Rock River Foundation was doing what every organization does now, posting live from its own event, the Centennial Founders Ball, all afternoon. And there was my mother, at the head table, accepting a plaque with both hands, standing between Devin and my father in front of a banner, all 3 of them beaming, time-stamped, 3:47 p.m., 3:52, 4:01. My ceremony started at 4. She had, in effect, published her own alibi, photographed, dated, and shared by a foundation with 11,000 followers. And meanwhile, my one photograph was quietly traveling. A night shift nurse shared it with something about doctors and nurses who show up. My college roommate shared it, and Denise. Denise shared it to her church group with 3 paragraphs and about 40 exclamation points. And church groups, I have since learned, are the fastest communication network ever built by human beings. By 6 o'clock that evening it had drifted, the way public things drift, into feeds that also followed the Rock River Foundation. Because northern Illinois is small, and my mother's face was on both screens on the same afternoon. And a woman named Charlene Doyle, 67 years old, in my mother's Bible study for 19 years. A woman who brought us a ham in 1998 did the arithmetic and typed it into a comment box. Wasn't Marlene's oldest getting married today? Look at the times on these pictures. Am I the only one seeing this? One comment. That's the entire conspiracy. I never wrote a word, never tagged a soul. I had spent 20 years editing my family's story, and my one act of revenge, if you want to call it that, was retiring. The internet turned out to be an extremely motivated replacement. What happened next happened in 2 places at once, and I love that I have to reconstruct one of them from screenshots because I genuinely was not there. At the barn, the band figured out the crowd and the plank floor Owen sanded finally earned it. Somebody's uncle did a dance that predates cable television. The little disposable cameras were popping their tiny flashes all over that barn like fireflies with opinions. 70 phones slept in a basket about 15 feet from the cake, and not one of us had any idea. In that same hour, in Rockford, the comment section under my mother's proudest afternoon caught fire from a single match. Charlene's comment got answers. Then the answers got answers. Women who had known my mother for 30 years started doing their own arithmetic out loud. Somebody found my photograph and pasted it in. Somebody read my caption to the room, so to speak. The front row was full, and that phrase did what a true sentence does in public. It went off on contact. By 8 o'clock, a woman on the foundation's board had quietly deleted the 4 o'clock post. By 8:30, somebody had screenshotted it and put it back. The head of the hospital auxiliary got messages at home. 2 people wrote, in public, under a photograph of my mother holding a plaque for community service, the same sentence in slightly different words. She couldn't do it for her own daughter. I want to be precise about the mechanics here because it matters to me. Nobody hacked anything, nobody lied, nobody exaggerated. Every bit of that fire was fueled by photographs my mother arranged to have taken at an event she chose on a date she refused to move. All I did was hold still and be plainly, verifiably real one time. It turns out that's the one thing a reputation machine can't answer. At the club, my father told me months later, in a parking lot, in the voice of a man describing a car accident from inside the car. My mother came back from the powder room and looked at her phone, and her whole face changed. 19 notifications, then 30. A voicemail from the auxiliary president, and the plaque still in her other hand. It was Devin who said it out loud. My sister read the top comment, and the color went out of her so fast my father reached for her elbow. She said, "Mom, everybody knows." And my father, Ray Bauer, a man who has weighed every sentence for how it might sound since 1998, said the only unedited thing he'd said in years, quietly to the window. He said, "I told you we should have gone." My mother did not answer him. She was already walking to the coat check. 140 miles of dark highway between the Rock River Club and Kestrel Hill. 2.5 hours to write something. My family has never once driven 2.5 hours without producing something. Keep that in mind as the headlights come up the hill. Back at the barn, Walter Kozlowski appeared at my elbow with his tie slightly crooked and asked, with the formality of a man who had clearly practiced, whether he might have this dance. The bandleader saw him and dropped into something slow. So I danced with an 83-year-old widower on a floor my husband had sanded by hand, and he was not good at it anymore. And about halfway through he said, right into my ear, Eleanor would have had something to say about that dress. And then he said, she'd have sat right where I'm sitting. The whole floor clapped time. And nobody filmed 1 second of it, and it happened anyway, completely, in front of every pair of eyes that mattered. When the song ended, he bowed like a diplomat and told me it was the finest wedding he'd been to in 20 years. Then he thought about it and said, well, it's the only one. Ruth found me by the cider table afterward, holding 2 glasses, and she was not smiling. She had her triage face on, the one I recognized because I own one. She'd gone out to the car for her wrap and looked at her phone, the one phone excused from the basket in case the caterer called. And being a fair woman, she gave it to me straight. The internet had found the timestamps. It was enormous and getting bigger, and there was almost certainly a car on its way. Then she touched her glass to mine and said the sentence I would like carved into something permanent. She said, whatever comes up that drive tonight, you've already had your wedding. Nobody can take it back off you. I looked down the hill at the gate. String lights, gravel, dark meadow beyond it. 20 minutes later, it filled up with headlights. The high beams swept across the fence line and found nobody to arrest, and the gravel popped under the tires, and the music did not stop, but the conversations did, one table at a time, in a wave that ran from the door to the cake, car doors, and then my parents were standing at the edge of the string lights, and I got my first look at their faces. I'm going to describe them clinically, because clinical is what I had left. I know what shock looks like. Gray, damp, pupils wide, the muscles of the face gone slack, because all available blood has been recalled for more urgent business. My parents were in shock, both of them. Textbook, just not the kind that comes from love. Nobody looks like that because they missed their daughter. People look like that when the ground goes out from under them, and their ground was what a town thought, and it was in free fall in my mother's hand, which had not let go of her phone, I noticed, not even to shut the car door. She was still in the good navy dress from the head table. My father was still in his tie, doing arithmetic he couldn't stop. And behind them, half out of the headlights, stood Devon, mascara down to her jaw, holding her own elbows, looking past me at the lights and the barn and the old people in their church clothes with an expression I had never once seen on my sister's face. It took me a second to place it, and then I had it. She looked like somebody standing outside a window, watching something she wasn't in. 70 guests were now performing the great American ritual of pretending not to stare. Owen's hand found the small of my back and asked a silent question. I answered it by walking down there alone, unhurried, a bride crossing her own reception toward whatever her family had drafted in the car. My mother did not open with sorry. I want that in the record, not out of cruelty, out of accuracy. She opened like a woman running a crisis call, because that's exactly what she was doing, and her firstborn was the account she needed access to. She kept her voice low, aware of the tables at the edge of earshot, and she led with the ask, Colleen, okay, listen to me. You need to take it down. People are twisting it. It's completely out of context, and it is spreading. I remember admiring, from somewhere far away, the efficiency of it. No hello, no congratulations. My wedding day had finally become interesting, and the interesting part was a fire, and I was the extinguisher. Then she laid out the plan, whole and polished, written somewhere on 2.5 hours of dark highway. I delete my photograph. Then tonight, one new photograph, all 5 of us under the string lights, my dress in the frame. She posts it with a caption she recited to me from memory, and I promise you this is close to word for word. Our girl moved her date up on us, and we drove half the night to get here. Best surprise of our lives. 1 picture fixes this, she said. 1. Then it's a misunderstanding. The foundation calms down, the ladies calm down, everybody moves on, and honey, tomorrow we will celebrate you like you've never been celebrated. Her phone kept lighting up against her palm the whole time she talked. Little pulses, like a second heartbeat, and every pulse turned her voice another quarter turn tighter, because every minute this went unanswered, the story hardened somewhere she couldn't reach it. And that pressure was real. I'm not mocking it. 19 years of a life were dying in her pocket while we stood there. Then my father stepped in close. 64 years old, quieter than I have ever heard him, and said the true version underneath all of it. Colleen, honey, your mother doesn't have anything else. She never has. This is... And he stopped, because there's no good end to that sentence. My mother said, Ray, the way you'd say it to a dog, and then they both looked at me, waiting for the editor. I didn't answer right away, and my silence did something to my mother that arguing never had. It broke her rhythm, and out of that crack came the realest thing I have ever heard her say. Her voice dropped out of its produced warmth into a register I hadn't heard since I was 8 years old. You don't remember what it was like, she said. You were a child. They were going to take the house, Colleen. Your father couldn't get out of bed. And I walked into that fellowship hall, and I made these people like us. I made them, and they kept us alive. That's what got you your braces. That's what kept the lights on while you studied your way out of here. Her eyes were shining, and none of it was a performance, and that was the terrible part. I have never been allowed to put it down, she said. Not one day in 26 years, do you understand me? Not one day. And for one long second I saw my mother whole, maybe for the first time in my life. 61 years old, standing in her good navy dress at the edge of her daughter's wedding, holding a phone that was going off in her hand like a slow explosion. A woman who built a raft in 1998 and was never once permitted to reach shore. The machine she ran had been running her. The pity arrived, real pity with weight to it. I let it stand right there next to everything else, and I did not let it decide. When I spoke the way I speak to frightened families in small rooms. Slow, level, and impossible to misunderstand. I said, I'm not taking it down, Mom. It's true. It stays up. And I'm not standing for the other picture because that one isn't. She started to speak, and I lifted 2 fingers off my thigh, barely, and something in her actually paused. But I'm not sending you away either. Look. And I turned and nodded toward the table by the barn door, 10 steps up the gravel, where the wicker basket sat under the string lights with 70 sleeping phones in it. You can stay, all 3 of you. There's cake. There's a band. Your daughter got married today, and this night is not over. I held her eyes. Phones in the basket. Come in as my family, not as an announcement. An invitation, not an ultimatum. The door open. And then I watched my mother look at that basket. What happened next took about 4 seconds, and it is the reason I am telling you all of this. She looked at the basket. She looked down at the phone in her hand, the screen going off and off and off, her whole collapsing world pulsing against her fingers. She looked back up at the basket, and her hand would not open. I don't mean she thought about it and said no. I mean I watched a physical negotiation fail. I watched her thumb go white against the case. I watched the tendons on the back of her hand get ready to let go, and then refuse. I have seen exactly that in hospital rooms, at bedsides, at the moment when it's time to let something go and the body simply will not. That basket was 10 steps away. It might as well have been across a river with no bridge on it, and my husband builds bridges out of 100-year-old wood, and even he couldn't have spanned it. I watched my mother try to put a phone in a basket and fail. That was my entire childhood in 4 seconds. Every empty chair, every ribbon nobody mentioned, every award that didn't count, all of it compressed into one hand that could not open. And here's what happened inside me, the part I did not expect. The last living cell of a lifelong belief died. And it didn't hurt. I had always told the story as, they cut me out. Standing at that gate, I finally saw my own hands on the scissors. I had trimmed myself out of frame after frame, made myself small, useful, invisible, so that their picture would work. And I had called that love. It was a job. And I was done working it. My father put his hand on my mother's shoulder. They turned and walked back to the car, and neither of them said goodbye, because there was nobody there to say it for. Devon stayed at the gate a moment longer, 1 foot on the gravel, 1 on the grass. Her eyes went from me to the barn, to the basket, and back. Then she followed them. I stood absolutely still in my wedding dress in front of 70 witnesses and let my family choose. The engine started. The light swung around. I did not run after that car. It was the most expensive standing still of my life, and I would do it again tomorrow. The taillights got small going down the hill, and I turned around and faced my own wedding. 70 people arranged in that careful national expression of, we saw nothing. Behind them, the band frozen mid-decision, the fiddle player's bow hanging over the strings like a question mark. I caught the band leader's eye. I nodded once, and the music came back a little too loud on purpose, the way good friends turn the radio up past a hard mile, and the floor filled, and my wedding simply resumed. Because real things resume. Owen got to me first and didn't say a word, just put his forehead against mine in the dark past the lights, which in our language is a complete sentence. Ruth appeared with a plate of cake I hadn't asked for and stood at my shoulder while I ate it, guarding, the way nurses stand. And then Nora, 9 years old, who had watched that entire scene at the gate with the frank staring of a child, took my hand and delivered her professional assessment. She said, "Your mom missed the cake. That was dumb." Out of the mouths of babes. She pulled me back onto that plank floor, and the little flashes started popping again all over the barn, and I danced at my wedding. Grass-stained, cried on, married and free. One more thing about that night, and then I'll let it end, because it matters more than anything my family did. I found the man who takes care of that property, and I made one request. Leave the gate open, all night. Lights on the drive until 2 in the morning. That's the part I made sure of. If a car had turned around on some dark stretch of Highway 15-1, it would have found the way and lit. Nobody came back through it, but the door I offered was real, and it stayed open longer than they stayed pale. 2 weeks later, a padded envelope came from a film lab in Madison, thick as a sandwich. All 20-some cameras finally developed. We opened it on the kitchen floor like kids with a cereal prize. By any professional standard, those pictures are terrible. Blurry, crooked, flash too close, horizons tilted about 15 degrees. There is an outstanding series of somebody's thumb. They are the truest photographs I have ever held in my hands. Nora mid-jump on the dance floor, bow sideways, all motion, and one sharp laughing eye. Ruth caught off guard with her head back, laughing with her entire medical history. Dorothy slow dancing with Denise, both of them dignified and awful at it. Walter Kozlowski, alone at a table, looking at a room full of dancing people with an expression I can only describe as a man visiting somewhere he used to live. And one frame, and to this day nobody has admitted to taking it, of Owen and me at the cider table, not posing, not touching, just looking at each other the way you look when you're sure nobody's watching. We bought an album, the old kind, with sticky pages. It lives on our bookshelf, it has never been online, and it never will be. One picture went up on the refrigerator, under a magnet shaped like Wisconsin, Nora, midair. My mother's constitution said that if nobody sees it, it may as well not have happened. I look at that refrigerator every single morning over coffee, and every single morning it hands down the same quiet verdict. Nobody saw it. It happened anyway. Here's the aftermath, measured, because I'm a nurse, and we chart outcomes, not feelings. The foundation issued no statement, which in small towns is louder than a statement. My mother resigned from the auxiliary in November. In a letter she described as stepping back for family reasons. 2 of the women who had been calling her every morning for 30 years stopped calling. The Bible study, from what I understand, got quietly rearranged. Nobody went hungry. Nobody lost a house. But my parents began, for the first time since 1998, living at approximately their actual size. My mother did what my mother does. She turned the wreckage into material. She gave a testimony at a women's breakfast in October about being misunderstood by the people you sacrifice for. I heard about it secondhand. I'm told I was described as very independent. And I want you to hear what I did about that. Nothing, no rebuttal, no correction, no phone calls to set anybody straight. The old Colleen would have had her mother's apology drafted by midnight. I went to bed. Retirement, it turns out, is a practice. You have to do it again every day for a while. Then, in early December, one message from my father. No preamble, no strategy, and this is how I knew it was really him. No ask for a do-over photograph. It said, Denise showed your aunt one of your pictures at church, the little girl jumping. Could you get me a copy? I stood in my kitchen and read that about 9 times. Then I printed it, wrote nothing on the back, put it in an envelope, and mailed it to Rockford. I'm told he keeps it in his wallet, the first unposted photograph my father has owned in 26 years. That's not nothing. That's a start. And then there's my sister. One evening in February, with the cold coming off the lake and about 4 inches on the ground, my doorbell rang, and Devon was standing on my porch with snow in her hair and no phone anywhere on her person, which for Devon was practically a medical event, hair in a low ponytail, no makeup. And in her eyes, that particular jet lag of somebody who has just powered down after 28 years on duty. She'd moved out. I'd heard that much. Got her own place in Loves Park. Went back for the early childhood classes she dropped at 19. She didn't explain any of it on the porch. She just stood there with her hands in her pockets and said, "Can I just be here for a while?" Those words. Nothing else. I opened the door. I put the kettle on, and she wandered through my kitchen and stopped in front of the refrigerator, in front of a blurry 9-year-old flying sideways through a frame under a Wisconsin magnet. She looked at that photograph for a long, long time. Then my sister said very quietly, "I don't think I've ever been in a picture nobody needed. We're working on it, off camera, where the real ones develop." Walter Kozlowski passed away this past spring, 84 years old, at home with a hospice nurse he requested by name. In his top dresser drawer, his son found a photograph, the blurry one of him with his head back laughing, in his funeral suit at a wedding on a hill in Wisconsin. It was the last picture ever taken of that man, and it is the only one in 50 years where he isn't sitting up straight for the camera. So if my story leaves you with one thing tonight, let it be this. The realest moments of your life will never be seen by very many people. And they don't have to be, because they'll quietly outlast every single thing that was. That's it. That's the whole story. 2 empty chairs, 1 true photograph, and a basket my mother could not reach into. If you've spent your life performing for somebody else's audience, or loving somebody who does, maybe tonight's the night you set the phone down and go sit at the table. And do me a favor before you go. Tell me what you would have done at that gate. I read every one of them.